Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Kathleen McInnes, Senior Fellow in the International Security Program and Director of the Smart Women, Smart Power initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington, D.C. I am absolutely thrilled to welcome you all to an in-person and online conversation about this timely and important book written by my colleague and his collaborators, Information in War, Military Innovation, Battle Networks, and the Future of Artificial Intelligence. It looks at why military organizations often struggle to integrate new technologies with a focus on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Here in the International Security Program at CSIS, we are grappling with the questions examined in this book every single day. How do we identify opportunities and risks and obstacles that will almost certainly confront modern defense organizations? This book, which I highly recommend to everybody, Information in War, deals with both historical cases and forward-looking scenarios to study the current challenges facing the Department of Defense when it comes to one of the hottest topics and most critically important technologies, artificial intelligence. So, as I mentioned earlier, today I'm joined by two of the three authors of the book, Dr. Ben Jensen, the Senior Fellow for Future War, Gaming, and Strategy in the International Security Program here at CSIS, and a beloved colleague, and also Lieutenant Colonel Scott Cuomo. Lieutenant Colonel Cuomo is a Marine Corps infantryman who has commanded at every level, from platoon to battalion, and is currently assigned to the Office of the Secretary of Defense Strategy and Force Development Office. Portions of the book are actually from his dissertation, which he completed at Georgetown University through the Commandant of the Marine Corps Strategist Program. So with that, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for producing this critically important book, which, again, the case studies, the way you frame the question of artificial intelligence and its adaptation and how it intersects with innovation and military bureaucracies, it's just a fascinating study. So, but I would like to start with a really simple question. What inspired you to write this book?
Well, my mom's probably watching, so I guess she did.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair.
Is that good, Mom? You got that?
Yeah.
Okay, we can move on now.
Ben's mom's good with it. Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I mean, this is actually the second book I've written on military innovation. And honestly, there's a little bit of a context here. I started writing about military innovation because as a company grade officer, every time I would show up in a graduate seminar, like what Scott went to at Georgetown, all I heard was about how military officers sucked at innovation. There were these magical, brilliant civilians who would come from the heavens to kind of help us understand what to do. And frankly, it kind of got under my skin. So I actually started writing about innovation probably from a subjective, irrational place, but as an academic, forced myself to be more objective and tried to understand when, where, and how do military professionals solve problems about the changing character of war. And so this book was just the latest iteration of that journey, and really now trying to take seriously, is there something distinct about innovation associated with advances in information technology to include artificial intelligence?
Well, and it's funny how a lot of these academic inquiries, they start with that itch that sort of like it's in the back of your brain, you know that there's a thing to look at, and then all of a sudden applying the academic lens and going through the rigor of exploring the question really leads to some fruitful insights. But for you, why Lieutenant Colonel Cuomo?
I think if you had to boil it down to one, it would be paying it forward. And so what do I mean, just building on what Ben laid out? So I've been blessed as a Marine almost 22 years now. My family's great. Great mentors, friends, however you want to describe our particular relationship, mentors in the service, and then thousands of great young junior Marines and sailors. It just helped me a bunch. That then led to the position that I had in the Commandant Strategist Program to really dive into, to a sense, take a break from the day-to-day of being a Marine, which is awesome, and just kind of take a step back and do this, similar to what Ben laid out. Like, how does this happen? How do you change an organization? And I got to dive into it, and it's like, okay, well, how do you pay? If the taxpayer is going to pay for the General Neller, General Berger is going to allow you to do it, a variety of other generals, then how do you help pay it forward so we can learn from this, especially given the rising threats to our country? That's kind of the one reason for me.
Yeah, fair enough. So how does this book fit within that larger literature on military innovation and adaptation that you were talking about, Ben?
Sure. So I think if there is one academic contribution to the book, it's trying to understand the interplay between bureaucracy and really people muddling through. And what I mean by people muddling through is that oftentimes when we think about technology as producing change, as a catalyst for change, we miss that there is no technology independent of the people that actually have to use it, make sense of it, understand it.
Right.
And those people and their agency is defined by a larger set of bureaucratic institutions with different authorities, different rules, the proverbial iron cage that each of them is struggling to work its way through. And to be fair, modern bureaucracy is really about a span of control that allows you to actually carry certain programs out. We couldn't spend hundreds of billions of dollars on defense without a bureaucracy, right? There isn't just the president with a checkbook, like you get a check, you get a check. You have to have some set of rules to guide it through. The proverbial challenge, though, is that the rules themselves and the process of innovation tend to come to these interesting friction points over time, making it difficult to adapt to circumstances change. In this book, which is well understood that there's all sorts of different ways of looking at military innovation. Is it a function of the international system? Is it a function of civilian intervention? Is it tactical learning from the bottom up? Is it a function of bureaucratic competition? So it's a well-trodden literature. I'd say what we did is actually take pieces of that literature and specifically try to integrate it into how you think about information technology in particular. Because the core research problem at the core of this book is the U.S. military. The U.S. military has invested in something called artificial intelligence for over 70 years.
Right.
So where is it?
Right.
Why has it taken so long? Why are there these fits and starts? It's not a technological problem. It's a function of people and their understanding, tacit knowledge, how they learn, how they make sense of instruments of war, and then how they do that from a bureaucracy. So that's where I'd say it fits. But the most important thing for me, beyond whether or not it resonates as an academic treatment, is that it does, as Scott was saying, pay it forward. It inspires other warriors and warfighters to actually be the change they want to see in their service, to act like, what else can I do? What conditions do I need to take care of the people I am charged to take into combat and to use violence in pursuit of political objectives?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I really appreciated about this work, the centrality of the human within this. I mean, none of these things come together, none of these things are actually adopted without the human. And it's just so easy for our community, the strategy community, to think about war in the abstract and thinking about it in terms of widgets and capabilities, but it's, war is a human endeavor, and even in the artificial intelligence space. Did you want to add anything?
I'll build on what Ben laid out and then dive into a couple of the cases and then how the analysis applies to the cases and looking just overall why it's not just as simple as top down, the president said so, or the SecDef said so. Of course, both of those are really important when that happens, but how does that interact inside the system? So looking at two cases that I enjoyed all the cases, going through the cases.
There were 7 cases? 8?
Depends how you break them down between three radar cases, 4 if you want to count post-Cold War, and then looking at the RMA between the paired comparison between the revolution
and military affairs,
between the Army and the Marine Corps, and then looking at remotely piloted aircraft systems and how they were or not adopted within the Air Force and the Marine Corps. So I'll focus on the latter two cases. So for example, in the first case in the 90s, the revolution of military affairs is the to-do. Everyone wants to talk about it. And
you couldn't escape it, right?
And so tough to some degree. Our book laying out, the Marine Corps wrote many of the concepts, and this kind of goes to the clash of the concept with increased information technologies. What does this mean to the human domain or the human element in warfare? Right. So some, in hindsight, have looked and said the Marine Corps in the 90s got all the concepts right. You're going to be able to take increased information technologies, push sensor information down, increase targeting to bring fires to bear against the enemy faster. Marine Corps wrote it all, and then was, that stuff might not work, weather might be a challenge, maybe the technology is not going to pan out. The Marine Corps kind of backed off of it, saying we're just going to focus on the human element, the chaos of war.
Right.
And we kind of, in some ways, although the last 22 years, I've loved serving in the military. We've done a lot of good things.
Yeah, of course.
But when you look at it objectively, it's like, maybe
Yeah.
we didn't go after this as hard. And it goes to what Ben was laying out. How did the ideas interact with the humans in the system?
Yeah.
And to really carry through on battle networks, you would have to change the structure within the organizations to figure out how do you set up the networks. And that was the second case that was most exciting to really dive into on remotely piloted aircraft systems. You know, in the modern, and right now, most in the national security community, if you think of a drone or you think of a Predator or a Reaper, it's almost synonymous. The Air Force did this. Whereas the book lays out, if you start the clock in 1990 when F-117s are bombing in Baghdad and you said, okay, stop it right there, who led the Department of Defense in remotely piloted aircraft employment? The answer was the Marine Corps.
Right.
The Air Force had none. It wasn't like they were in last place, they had none. And so how, the book going into how over the course of 20 to 30 years do you go from a case where one service is in the lead, another service not even on the ball field, to that service is not even in the lead, like by far in the lead, and the other services. How did all of that happen? And really diving into that with the way we lay out the impact of closed and open structures within organizations, the channel capacity, the ability for an organization to be willing to take on new ideas. It was really fascinating to dive into that.
And actually, for the benefit of our audience, could either of you elaborate on what battle networks actually means?
Fight war better. No, seriously, in all seriousness, it's about, in traditional military theory, there's been a tendency really since our kind of focal point on Napoleon to develop a lot of modern military theory, even though, truth be told, most of the theory predates him to thinkers about the Enlightenment and trying to apply science of the day and geometry to understand maneuver. But it really crystallizes a military theory with Napoleon and reflections upon Napoleon by Jomini, but really also by Clausewitz. And when you look at principles of war, which is more of a Jominian approach, one thing that really stands out there is the concept of aligning mass plus objective.
Okay.
Like if I had to think of creative combinations of principles, if you align mass plus objective, all things being equal, you should win that engagement. That's how you get relative power calculations. You can just see how that deductive theory pulls its way forward, even the modern way we plan. So why does that matter? Well, when you talk about a battle network, you can't bring mass against an objective if you don't actually know where the objective is in time and space. And if you do actually able to spread information across your formation, whether it's through fires, signals, anything, you can now think about economy of force and objective and generating tempo over time, because you're not culminating by massing on the objective. And I know that sounds like horrible military gobbledygook, but it's really important.
Right.
Because it means that information itself becomes as important, if not more, than the size of your formation. Right. That is a really important point that a lot of people get stuck on, even to this day, in debates about forces. Like we pivot to what's the size of the force in terms of the number of boots we're buying, when that's the wrong question. It should be how interoperable is that force in terms of its ability to pass information, understand itself, situational awareness, relative to the environment and the adversary, and then actually dictate the tempo by actually determining how it's going to take actions on an objective relative to the adversary's response. So that's why information is important, and battle networks facilitate that exchange.
Right. So what surprised you both over the course of writing this book?
Yeah, building on the remotely piloted aircraft, the UAV case, what surprised me, one, when you dive into it and you start and you say, okay, this service led, how did it go, and how does that apply to the military innovation literature writ large? And then see the development. So maybe it would be helpful to riff kind of on the battle network. So if we bring ourselves back to 1990 through 93, President Clinton comes in, post-Cold War, and we have the conflict and the atrocities in the Balkans. And this is how we get the Predator. So that's kind of laying this out. And President Clinton is very frustrated because there's atrocities happening throughout the Balkans, and the military, despite just winning the Cold War, being the most powerful, is, I need to know what the heck is going on so I can make decisions. Our allies are pressuring us to put troops on the ground. I don't know what to do. And he's shocked because the intelligence community couldn't give him the answer. And one thing, so you go, none of the services are excited about some type of remotely piloted. The Marine Corps led and was like, let me kind of out of the Gulf War, post after action reports praising it. The Marine Corps is like, not interested in this. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the point being, from the EUCOM commander at the time, down through the Joint Staff and the Pentagon, said, hey, we think we can come up with a way to provide persistent coverage of what's going on with the atrocities. And as it relates to battle networks, you just think through, we're in 1992, 1993, I have to lay fiber lines across the world. I'm going to have an aircraft up for 40 hours. Like, these are not the way you think of things. You think of an aircraft flying for 30 minutes, 2 hours, and you think of that's a maneuver asset dropping a bomb. You don't think of that as a sensor that's an intelligence asset, that's a communication relay, and this goes back to how does this interact with the force structure of an organization. You almost have to change the entire organization at its core to take advantage of this technology, because it is a pure battle network. And when it finally was made to work in 1994, it was described as magic. And the long and short of it, there was a Predator flying as a test before it went to the Balkans on the U.S.-Mexican border outside of Fort Huachuca, and they routed the feed into the Pentagon and brought it up to the senior leadership, and they're like, this is magic. Like, how is this happening? Like, now we don't think of this. Now we're like, of course. You see videos all over the place. But then, okay, so now the Secretary of Defense has the magic sitting in front of him. Now I want to proliferate this and put it into a combat theater. How do you do that? And that took, we sing Pray the Predator comes to existence in 1995. The Air Force really doesn't embrace this until Secretary Gates has to do some pretty magical things in 2008, 9, 10. So that's, I think, surprised me even in the book lays out, just because you have a technology does not mean you have an innovation.
Right.
So in this particular case,
it's so easy to conflate the two, right?
Exactly.
And,
Exactly.
Interesting.
So that's the biggest surprise for me.
Yeah. The best cases are the ones that flip your understanding of what you thought to see something new. So I think Scott really hit on that. For me, and I'll be honest, I'm going to beat myself up a little bit here, as someone who came to the innovation literature as an angry captain, which, most military officers have like an angry company grade phase. It could be lieutenant, it could be captain, it's somewhere in there.
It's a rite of passage, it's fine.
So I think I still fully believe the military profession has a sacred oath and responsibility to contribute to the marketplace of ideas about what war is and its character. I think this book helped me see more that it's the diversity of the networks they share those ideas along that matters. And what I mean by that is in both the radar case and really the development of modern computing, which is an underappreciated story because it directly links to early Cold War concepts of how we're going to defend ourselves against the Soviet Union. Total threat inflation about what we thought the Soviets could do. But without that threat inflation, you wouldn't have that iPhone in front of you.
Right.
So I guess a little threat inflation can be good. But the diversity of the network that exchanges ideas increases the probability of novel adaptations. And so you wouldn't have had the British ability to respond effectively with radar compared to the Americans and the French without the ability of the Tizard Committee and other groups that actually brought in civilian science. So the emergence of modern battle networks is also a really interesting story about the role of the technical bureaucrat. How do you have these technical experts that can kind of go in and out of government from academia and from industry to kind of change the ideas and debates? And so I think it's an appeal for diversity of perspective in how you can exchange ideas about what war is and how you fight it, which is still the responsibility of the military profession. But at least in some of the cases, it was more complex than the traditional literature, which is, it's civilians intervening, without really decomposing how those civilians work as programmers and switchers to kind of circulate those ideas. So that was the thing that, as someone who studied innovation now for, it's been a while, right?
Okay,
It's been over a decade. That's the thing that really jumped out at me. And now, what does that mean going forward? Is we probably really got to rethink what public-private partnerships are. Mm-hmm. It means a very creative role for the private sector, which again, closed structures, our current DoD ecosystem for procurement does not lend itself to creatively working with the private sector. So it actually was another red flag moment for me of like, hey, we got to watch this going forward because we're not going to be able to scale up commercial innovation and take advantage of those diverse networks because we keep limiting our own ability to exchange information inside the Department of Defense and inside the military profession.
And if I could push you on that a little bit further, in terms of, again, you mentioned public-private partnerships, but also the exchange of personnel, the ability of individuals to jump in and out of government, in and out of military service. Where do you see us in that, our ability to harness that kind of talent and have that cross-pollination, or do we have a lot more work to do?
I mean, every service has some version of talent management, and it's trying to deal with this issue. I think it's even a bit more complex because it's not just about where an individual goes, whether you have a uniform one day, a suit the next, or flip-flops the next.
Right.
It's also your ability to have contracting vehicles that allows a military professional to be able to sit down with industry without committing to procurement or about putting themselves at risk, and actually openly have a conversation about, hey, I want to solve X problem.
Right.
How can I do that? Right. Unfortunately, the modern bureaucracy, because it is validly concerned about all sorts of irregularities and large programs, constrains the ability of the professional to have conversations with technical experts in an expedient manner. Or is so overburdened by compliance issues about what online training did you do? Did you do a mass formation to tell them don't commit this basic human sin this time of day? You have so many compliance issues that crowd out the space of, well, when I was in battalion command, you're in battalion command, he couldn't just call up DARPA and say, hey, I'm going to carve out a month for us to go to a training range together, bring your craziest stuff. What are we doing if we don't let professionals have that type of access and fluidity? We're completely hamstringing ourselves in a way that's avoidable if we just opened up the structures a little bit.
Yeah. Turning to some of the bigger picture questions, I guess, that have been part of the debate on artificial intelligence for quite some time, and the intersection with the future of warfare. There's this question out there that's been bandied about does artificial intelligence have the capability or capacity to change the nature of war versus the character of war? I mean, the idea being that if humans aren't part of this, then does that fundamentally change the nature of war? So based on your research, and you've delved into this world in writing this book, I'm very curious as to your thoughts on that question. Is AI, does it have that sort of transformational capacity or not so much?
All right, I'll jump on that. And so the short answer is it's not going to change the nature of war. So for the way I have been taught and understand the nature of war, you're in a battle of human wills that is going to, for as long as I can, kind of looking forward, be nasty at the forward edge of where that battle is taking place. There'll be human wills there, and that's not going to change. I think you could say of what's going on in the Donbass right now, for example, you have a variety of information technologies that are enabling, and this goes to the character as well.
Yeah.
Decisions are faster, they're more violent. If you're in a location, and I was thinking as Ben was commenting earlier on the highway of death coming out of the Gulf War, we have an image in our mind in the national security community of a highway of death. We have a lot of highway of deaths in the last 11 plus months in the conflict in Ukraine, in all sorts of parts of it. So I think you're going to find at the forward edge, wherever that fight is going on, you're going to find information technologies enabling or having the potential to enable better situational awareness, potentially better lethality directly, if not by informing what you're firing at. So that I see there. And then another level you're going to have, and it's going to be challenging because we're going to have to make sure the battle networks enable it from you hear about predictive logistics or logistics of knowing what's, having some type of algorithm help you understand, hey, I'm driving these vehicles and this part's going to break so that you can have less people and less of a signature there. I think there's potential, there's definitely, and it's already happening. Now, as it relates to what are potentially some of the, within the character, so bottom line, nature staying the same. Character go faster.
Yep.
It's going to be how do you, and it goes back to the force structure question, how do you, because every time you become more reliant in some ways on a phone or on a network, there's potential attack vectors for the adversary to attack into, change what you're looking at on a screen, or manipulate your network, change your frequencies, whatever the case might be. So part of the challenge, and I'm encouraged by this, of going back to Ben's comment on talent management efforts, Let's just take the service that I have the privilege to be a part of, the Marine Corps. We think of the Marine Corps as infantry. The Marine Corps, as part of the force design effort, is pushing down signals Marines, cyber Marines into these formations so that if you're becoming, in some cases inevitable, more dependent on networking, because why wouldn't you? We use it. You have to make sure that you have the technical knowledge there to help build the network and defend the network. So it's a long answer to a fairly short question. Nature's not changing. Character will speed things up. There's vulnerabilities with that, so we've got to change the force structure to make sure that the enemy can't exploit them.
So going back to unpacking some of one of the theses of your book, why do military organizations struggle to integrate new information technologies?
Yeah, I think we've been kind of
why is it so hard? Yeah.
You know, life's hard.
Well, there's that.
Sometimes, for as much as we like to beat up in the military, I think about my other life as an academic. And when academics make fun of the military, it's like a feudal guild making fun of an industrial union. Neither are perfect by any stretch of the imagination. But if I had to really decompose what we found over the course of the case studies, it's that one, it's whether or not the bureaucracy is open or closed to allow you to take advantage of the increased rate of information.
Okay.
And so it's not just bureaucracy bad, it's bureaucracy is a necessary good.
Right,
Actually,
you have to
evil,
systematize things,
good.
right? Yeah.
The question is whether or not the bureaucratic design allows you to take advantage of increases in your ability to exchange information along the battle network.
Okay.
So, I mean, do a little thought experiment. Napoleon would have kicked butt with AI. Why? Because he was a natural operational thinker who would have thought about, where do I put the central position to be able to threaten in two directions? How do I do operational reach? How do I think about how to attack the seam of my adversary? Those are all solvable technical problems that are about information. Where to position yourself, where the adversary is located, understanding of your own operational reach. Can you generate effects over time? When to delegate the initiative to subordinate commanders who might have better visibility. That's all about information.
Right.
It's all about information. So in some sense, if you allow a bureaucracy that allows you to exchange that information in a military bureaucracy, a modern military bureaucracy, post-Napoleonic, it'll do great. What we normally find, though, is that there's a lot of rigidity about integrating these new capabilities. Right? There isn't necessarily, this gets to these more nuanced questions also of trust. And when you talk about whether or not a warfighter trusts a piece of technology, you start to then enter the second variable, and that's resonance. Does your understanding of any technology match your vision of how you fight wars? Every military officer, and I think this is true across the profession, it's not just officers and enlisted, has some image, whether articulated or not in their mind, of what war is and how they fight it. And it usually resolves around solving a discrete tactical problem. We probably should focus more on some of the discrete operational, but it's more visceral at the tactical level because it's a clash of wills. And so that image will match or not match as they exchange ideas and tell each other stories about any technology. And the extent to which it resonates, that technology helps me solve this problem, it is more likely to then lead to some type of adaptation. So those are really the two factors. Does the bureaucracy increase channel capacity? Does it allow you to take advantage of this exchange of information? And then source coding. Are you actually able to make sense of the new technology in relation to solving a military problem? And we kind of adopted Claude Shannon's information theory to use those kind of heuristics, those ways of describing this effective bureaucracy and really storytelling inside of a bureaucracy.
Well, to unpack that question a little bit further, what is it about bureaucracy that complicates technological innovation? Why? We talk about facilitating it, but what are the obstacles really?
Yeah, but if we look at, I'm thinking the radar cases, so 3 cases, if you want to call it, the UK, France, and the US that we tackle, and then look at the revolution of military affairs and the RPA. So arguably 7 of the total cases are happening in the first 3 in the interwar period prior to World War II. Budgets are not that high. You have, to what Ben's laying out, you have the organizations that think they know what they are. They have the images of who they are. They have relatively limited funding, and they're doing what they think they are intended to do. And so if a new technology comes along, it's not like there's more money coming in most cases. There's not like extra Marines or soldiers like sitting here with nothing to do. So you have to repurpose that. And in the case in the Revolution of Military Affairs in the RPA case, this is post-Cold War, the peace dividend, save money, cut all the services. So what you have inside the services as a default, just basic human nature of I want to keep, let's just look at the Air Force case, which is amazing of how much they turned over 15. General McPeak was the chief at the time, right after the Gulf War. He wouldn't touch an RPA. He viewed the Air Force's mission was fighter and then to a lesser degree bomber. And if you weren't talking about that, he didn't want to talk about it. It was very clear. And so it took service chiefs, and he's saying, I'm already losing my fighters and bombers as part of this peace dividend. Why am I going to invest? And so it's not anybody's doing anything wrong. It's going back to Ben's point. They think that this is what, hey, we did great things with the fighter and bomber aircraft in the Gulf War. Let's just make better ones.
Right.
And so it requires some type of external stimulus, it requires a lot, but it goes back to, is the organization, will you eventually have the leader? And in the case of the Air Force, with RPA, it takes General Fogelman coming in about 5 years later, who has in his mind reconnaissance missions over Vietnam, manned reconnaissance missions of him flying and almost dying, saying there's probably a better way to do this.
Right.
And that comes into the channel capacity. There's different feelings amongst the Joint Staff and the Pentagon, and clearly from the White House, and we want these capabilities. And he's like, maybe this is a new type of air power. Maybe we should do this. And so, hopefully that.
So you're having a champion that helps take something that's initially perceived as a good idea fairy kind of concept to something that can be actioned.
What I worry about in the modern discourse about innovation is I think our expectation of how fast things can happen are unrealistic. And in all these cases, it's very rare that a service leader can force through all of the change needed, even within one service, in 4 years. And so there's these real time pressures, there's budget pressures. I mean, we're seeing this play out in the Marine Corps right now. But I think more important than that debate is how do we, and this is really more for Congress and national security professionals, think about the rate of change. Because if you try to force change too quickly, that's when you get the most bureaucratic antibodies.
Yeah.
And how do you create the possibility of having an honest dialogue about change that can extend across multiple leaders, vice just kind of one service, almost viceroy who does it? That's really hard in the modern bureaucracy. And we have really good leaders across the services who struggle with that idea daily. And it's not that they don't know. All the generals, if you're a 4-star general, you know your other 4-star generals. So they're talking about this, they're trying to figure it out. But I think sometimes the pressure of the new, the now, deprives them of the space they need to really make the change. So while we'd like to think all these changes are rapid and instant, because you're changing bureaucratic structures and you're changing the story you're telling about war across your formation, that is not instant. And it really requires a lot of investment at echelon to give people space to experiment. Because the best way someone can learn to change their story is through a war game, a field exercise, and when it comes to it, a fight, right? That's what will accelerate change, but you can't just force it down. You can't say we're doing this and then expect it to happen. It's going to be clunky. So it's how do you create those environments as leaders where people will start to tinker, experiment, they'll tell different stories, and then you can scale up the bureaucratic change.
Well, and I wonder to what extent that clashes with this perceived need for, and arguably just need for agility and for the ability to move rapidly, to do rapid acquisition, rapid technology. But these things take time. Organizational cultural change takes time. And so being able to balance that tension is a really important insight from the book. Well, so if you guys were to issue a report card on U.S. adaptation of artificial intelligence and technologies, where do you think the U.S. is today?
I'll take that one.
Sure.
I'm going to give us a C.
Okay.
Now it's a C with room for improvement.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
It's a C with like a room for improvement, because I think that, again, because change is hard, I think some of the recent attempts to realign key entities in the Department of Defense and to really put secretariat level, like Deputy Secretary of Defense investment in accelerating some of our work with artificial intelligence and machine learning, we won't know for a few years until that takes hold. So I think we're at a C, but it's like a term paper that's written where it's like, wow, there are flashes of brilliance in here. I bet on the second draft, this is going to be a better paper.
Okay.
And I think the key thing to watch now is two things. At the bureaucratic level, can we make it so that any DoD warlord, and there are warlords in DoD.
What?
Yeah, I know. That the DoD warlords of various stripes cannot hoard their data and have to share their data, and the same goes for defense manufacturers. That anything the US taxpayer buys to secure the nation comes with common data standards and the ability to create large data lakes with open standards so that we can actually take advantage of the battle network. Because right now we're still in a very tribal approach to data and networks that we always have to develop a new technical solution to get beyond it. It's a solvable engineering problem. It is a difficult policy problem. The second, and this goes out to students that I'm making suffer learning basic data analysis right now. You know who you are. If you don't cede the force with people who understand how to interpret a model and how to know when it's right or wrong in that situation, you won't be able to take advantage of it. You'll have the technology built, you'll have the bureaucracy aligned, but you won't build that trust factor.
Right.
And the models will never be right 100% of the time. They never will. War is a complex system. But how does that young company commander who's been mentored by that battalion commander know when to say, hey, the model is telling me this, but my intuition says this, or I think the circumstances are different. Until we have a force that has basic data science familiarity, I think we're not going to be there. And that's a commitment to how we actually teach the military profession. History is our heart, but we can match our heart with a mind that actually can think inductively.
Thus beginneth the next phase of the PME wars. But going on to your point about warlords within the Department of Defense, there's a variety of actors now that are involved in the AI space. Do you see this proliferation of actors as a net positive? Are there too many cooks in the kitchen? How do you see this in terms of the overall ability of the Department of Defense to adapt these technologies?
Honestly, look, it'll depend, right? In some sense, a lot of competing organizations inside can spur productive competition. But if it becomes a fight for resources or worse, in a lot of bureaucratic literature, turf and money, meaning everyone's saying, well, I get to only one who decides that, right? This is my network. I decide what goes on it. It will quickly descend. And in fact, one of our scenarios, which we'll get to in a little bit, actually deals with that, wild goose chases. There's all these little investments going on, but none of them successfully scale in a way that actually brings you anywhere.
So back to big picture policy questions. How do you view the intersection of developments in artificial intelligence and their application to these big questions like integrated deterrence and strategic competition?
I'll jump on that. I think the potential is enormous, and where we're at, and let's just take the Western Pacific with the PRC and the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and bullying. I think it's okay that maybe 4 years ago you couldn't say that. Now I think it's all right to say that. The role that AI can play with our allies, just take the recent the Secretary of Defense 2+2 talks with Japan and the Secretary of State for that matter, laying out new formations, specifically one in the Marine Corps, one in the Army, but the larger point being to really leverage this. One of the biggest areas that it's open source we talk about, we want domain awareness, in this particular case maritime domain awareness of what are the actions going on in the East China Sea, what's going on in the South China Sea, what's going on in West Philippines, laying all of that out for political leaders to be able to make recommend decisions as it relates to deterrence, like this is what's happening, time now.
Right.
This is an unacceptable behaviors, and the potential is enormous, and we're sitting in such a great spot because of our alliance architecture to have the formations and the battle networks that we essentially have spent. It depends on your start point, but let's just take I don't want to call out specific companies. The lessons learned over the last 30 years of worldwide battle networks that were either U.S. exclusive or U.S. with less than a handful of allies, now expanding that to share data in aggregate on situational awareness to help inform each respective our own, of course, political leadership and then of our allies to then lay out, hey, this is what's happening right now with a bullying action, like literally as we're speaking time now. I think is a huge potential versus gaps where you may have had, I'll leave the countries out, but you can imagine a country that's an ally that's being, and I equate it sometimes to being on a playground in 4th or 5th grade, and the bully shows up and picks on someone, and you're not there to help your friend, and he comes back 3-4 days later and says, hey, I got bullied, where the hell were you? You were supposed to be. Well, now data can help us do that, and it's a huge advantage that we have with our alliance architecture because we can put the right people forward. You don't need 1 million people. You don't need a corps, an Army Corps or a division of Marines. You might need 5 to 10 right Americans sitting next to the right allies and leveraging AI, and I think there's great potential, and we're already seeing a lot of the benefits to it.
Ben, did you want to jump in?
No, I think what Scott's hitting on, though, is moving just from a strictly military perspective to competition as a whole of government and partner networks. So integrated deterrence isn't just apply JADC2, pour some water on it, and you get the Chia-Peta deterrence. It's that you have to actually build in the ability to work seamlessly across your partners and multiple instruments of power. Well, again, that starts with information and situational awareness. If you don't know they're being picked on, and you also don't even know how to measure your own actions to deter them, do we have an objective way of measuring whether a straight transit increases or decreases the probability of an escalation event by the Chinese Communist Party within 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Do we even fully understand their decision-making calculus, how they're weighing information, the way it plays through the information space, and how that compares to like pen names they'll use in Communist Party outlets to signal us? I think we have a huge competition blind spot because we're not approaching it as a data-driven exercise. We're approaching it more on hunches and seminal cases, and we compare everything to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, everything isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a good thing, right? So how do we make sense of competition to gain a position of advantage starts with information. It's not just war, it's information and competition.
And a Chia-Peta deterrence.
Chia-Peta deterrence.
There we go. So organizational cultures and constraints have a direct impact on the kind of successful adoption of information technologies that leads to innovation. And the book touches on, it's focused on the US primarily, but there's these other case studies. It touches on China a little bit. I was wondering though if you could expand on your analysis to these other strategic competitors like China and Russia. What constraints or opportunities do you see for them when it comes to adaptation or adoption of AI technologies and innovation?
I think I'll speak quickly about the bad guys.
Sure.
And I'll let Scott talk about the partners.
Perfect.
I would say that I think most people are overestimating the advantages authoritarian regimes will face with this technology. I know that's a bit contrarian. In one sense, domestically, because they have no concerns about civil liberties, they will hoover up as much information as they can, which frankly a lot of consumer firms are okay with that in other free countries, and begin to use that to calibrate who is a good citizen, who is a bad citizen, who to throw in jail, who to just send a thug over to their house, back to the bully. Sometimes the smartest bully just shows up and looks. They don't have to rough them up because just the presence does it. They're very good domestically in scaling this stuff up. I think where they will struggle is that actually battle networks require bottom-up and top-down exchanges of information, and authoritarian regimes are prone to a fundamental lack of trust, which means information is only seen as flowing up. Now play the thought experiment. If all you ever do is get in trouble, are you going to report accurate information up the system? My sense is as they scale up their battle networks in war, they will prove to be so full of lies and brittle that they will be exquisite for the one mission they're trained to and find it very difficult to adapt. Now, if we're not careful, because back to resonance and culture and bureaucracy, we could be prone to the same trap. So what will save us is, frankly, being contentious Americans and arguing, but being honest about what's working and what's not. No more ethical fading, real readiness numbers, real battlefield performance, and a healthy dialogue across echelons of command. That'll actually make our networks better than their networks. Authoritarian regimes have no trust, and that is their greatest weakness point as societies.
I wasn't thinking in the script coming in, and Ben sparked it, just building on the advantage in our system versus potentially. And of course, you got to be careful with saying all authoritarian regimes are like X. Let me give you an example of a battle network. About whatever this was now, 10 months ago, I had the privilege to lead a unit in the Baltics. Spare the details of what exactly we were doing, what systems and whatnot, aside from saying one of our tasks was to, dancing around classification here, monitor what an adversary is potentially doing in a maritime domain. I'll leave it at that, and audience can figure out what we're doing there. My communications officer, which that wasn't an appropriate title anymore, I said, Tom, you're our communicator. You're basically our C5 ISRT and everything else. So himself and Staff Sergeant Groom, so basically our technical data experts on our battle network come in. And we have sensors all over this part of the world, and one of them goes out. And I like to think I'm a pretty nice guy. Some would say I'm pretty intense. And so Tommy walks up scared, and I could tell something's wrong. This is like an A+. Like you can't, if you could clone this guy, you'd do it in a heart. But you could tell there's something he's going to say, and he thinks that I'm going to start yelling at him or something. So Tom comes up and he says, sir, this sensor doesn't work. A cable, the power interface cable broke. Okay, that's unacceptable. Fix it. And he went to VMI. He was a physics major at VMI. Yeah. I'm like, Tommy, take the damn thing apart, put it back together. You're the physics major. I'm not. Get it to work.
How much duct tape does it need?
And he's panicked. And I don't mean this. I love him. He's like, oh crap. And he's trying to do right. He's trying to do right by the unit. He's trying to do. And he's so nervous. And I was like, Tommy, with this staff sergeant, both of them had done such amazing things. I was like, you guys figured out how to set up this network? Going back to our earlier conversation. There was no script for it. There was no book for it. We're leveraging those. Figure it out. And he's like, oh, crap. So that it doesn't work is not an acceptable answer. And I was like, Right. Go find it. And so he comes back in about 30 minutes. He comes back and he says, sir, you told us when we came over here that we were not to be the ugly Americans, from the book Ugly American. And I said, yeah, where are you going with this, Tommy? And he says, I can get the sensor to work, but I'm going to have to ask a local to come into work at night. I'm like, what on earth are you talking about? He's like, I got on Facebook Live, and in the town, in this capital of this country, the specific sensor that we were using is in one of their stores. The shop closed an hour ago. I'm talking to the owner, and he said, if you really want it, he'll come back to work. But I think that might cross the threshold of being an ugly American. And so the point there, if you're not, to riff on Ben's comment, if you don't have a culture where the Marine or the soldier, whomever, is willing to say, hey, we got a problem, there's a hole in the system. Yeah. It's easy to say, hey, I'm going to leave that dot in the system and manipulate it, and it's wrong data. Right. You're going to have problems. And it's one of the huge advantages that we have, I believe, in the West, certainly in the States, of just the way our cultures are. Not everything's perfect, but that you can have bottom-up creativity. I would have never been able to create the network. Right. Tom could, Staff Sergeant Groom's could, and then they could figure out how to riff the network when it broke. Right. And so it worked, and they got it right up. They got the power interface cable. Going back to the contract, gave them $200 or whatever, and they bought it, and done.
But you didn't yell at him.
No yelling.
No yelling with your eyes?
No. I was giving him a giant hug saying, Tommy, you're a wicked smart. You're going to figure it out somehow.
But it's all about the people,
yeah,
right?
Indeed.
But so speaking of people and fiction, creativity, this book uses one of the key tools for communication of big concepts and key themes since we've been cavemen around campfires, which is fiction, to start exploring what the future could look like. And you break this up into 4 different scenarios of how things could play out. Could you walk us through what the scenarios are?
So first, the big reveal to whoever is streaming this right now.
Including your mother.
We'll find out.
We'll find out.
I'll get a call. Okay. So, no, for everyone, you've been seeing images actually from Midjourney, AI-generated art rotating beyond you. So one of the things we did in preparation for this was actually enter in some of the themes into a generative AI art program. and then let it run wild. That's why you see images of soldiers in empty cubicle bays. That's not a good news story. That's bad bureaucracy. You see something that looks like Ryan Gosling, like fusing with the computer, like maybe that's him as imagining itself, but those are all AI-generated images around this idea of how military bureaucracies will or will not be able to change as you alter information technologies, including the latest iteration of artificial intelligence machine learning. What you're seeing now are actually images taken from each of the fictional pieces. So one of the reasons we did this is, A, now that I'm a senior scholar, I can be playful. One of the horrible things about academia is when it's your first or second book, you don't really get to do much experimenting. Well, with the fifth, you can. And one of the things, exactly as you pointed out, was stories are sticky. And if part of this whole, like what we're finding here is how people tell stories about war matters for how they visualize themselves in solving problems, then we needed to visualize senior leaders in a defense bureaucracy under different possible combinations of bureaucratic openness or closed, and whether tacit knowledge was flowing or not, whether there was high resonance or low resonance. So in a very traditional political science 2x2 table, that really gave us 4 scenarios.
Right.
So the first scenario was fragmented AI. That meant that, you had this world kind of like Gordon Sullivan in the Army. And that's another thing in this book. Gordon Sullivan, my first book, William Depew was my hero. Gordon Sullivan's now my hero because that prophet saw the future of war from 1991. He saw it very clearly. The problem was the bureaucracy was not ready, and maybe the technology was just starting to get there.
Right.
So in that type of world of fragmented AI, you have these images, you have these stories, and people are trying to build these things. Even the RMA is really the descendant of Soviet military theory and Assault Breaker, which is a 1978 DARPA experiment, which we're largely only starting to get the second offset right today, much less the third offset. So fragmented AI is that world where you can kind of see the future, but it's always like looking through a broken glass. The second one, ideal AI, is you're able to tell those stories. You're able to align the bureaucracy and things happen. So each of these scenarios is a day in the life where literally the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is riding to car to work, and you just experience their morning.
Right.
And you see also how the technologies then infuse very simple acts of how they read the news, how do they ride to work, how are they entering the five-sided puzzle palace, like what does that look like? The third, we already kind of mentioned, wild goose chases. You have all these little bureaucratic efforts to capture resources or doing something, but they're not cohesive. And then the final one is just utter stagnation, where you have kind of the proverbial old man on horseback who refuses to accept change and will, charge the trench line, consequences be damned, with his sheer elan and will.
Mm-hmm. So what did you guys learn from the writing of the scenarios?
Well, one, and then it goes back to these fictional scenarios and then the cases in the book. The future is certainly not predestined, so we have a huge role to play, and goes back to your earlier question on military innovation and the role of humans within the various networks. Which one of these 4 are going to happen is going to be heavily based on role of organizations like yours, the people that rotate in and out of. If we don't do this right, any one of these can happen. I'm optimistic. I think we're heading in the right direction right now. Probably somewhere in the one leaning toward maybe.
Okay.
But I'm going to steal from one of my mentors in General Matter. Like this isn't no foregone conclusion that America is going to win this thing. We have a critical role to play to shape these technologies in the way that we want, based on our value systems, and then make sure that we can use them in the competition for the right ways. And so going through and thinking through, how could this morning be? How could you move to the Pentagon? This really could happen if we jack this up.
Yeah.
If we don't get these structures right, these investments are not right, we don't figure out the rapid acquisition, this could easily happen.
Yeah.
Let's not let that happen.
Well, so he's just answered which scenario he thinks is more likely than the others. Ben, where do you think we're headed if current trends persist?
It's always dangerous to say you're in a critical moment, because everyone in their moment of time thinks it's a critical moment, but not every moment can be critical. So at the risk of committing that sin, I really do think the next 4 to 8 years are absolutely critical.
Okay.
And Scott's hit the nail on the head. we're at a point where we could literally trend into any one of these scenarios. And what I think our defense leaders, I will do my best to help them from my little fighting position. It's going to get harder as the budgets get crunched. I don't think we've really thought of the effects of a increase in long-term interest rates while inflation still hasn't fully come down on the defense budget. So the slack in the system for you to maybe move money around to play with these isn't there. Your ability to capture talent from society, we love all of our fighting men and women and people, but we maybe aren't capturing the right mix, and we haven't really thought about that. So I think there are some very large structural factors that the book doesn't really get into that are going to make it even harder for defense leaders to make sure that we end up in scenario 2 and not in 1 or 3. I don't think we're in stagnation. I think there's enough energy there to avoid that, but we need leaders to be laser focused. And I think if I had to ask them to do one thing, it's not just get the programmatics right, it's actually create that culture of experimentation. Right? I want to see formations that are allowed to break things, to build these things from the bottom up. And there are good signs for that. Scarlet Dragon, the recent experiment, the 18th Airborne Corps, stories like what Scott told you about. We need to make those that every warrior has one of those stories and love sharing it. Right? Then you start to have things take over. But I do think we'll get it right, but I'm an eternal optimist.
So in our limited time that we've got left, we have a couple of questions from the audience that came in. One is, how are other countries advancing in the AI revolution? How are we seeing countries like Ukraine and others adapting these technologies?
Yeah, I'll jump on that first. I think there's the non-state, so let's hone in on Ukraine and then work out.
Sure.
So I think at this juncture, almost a year in, we're seeing that non-state actors and then other commercial companies, let's just take Starlink, for example, if we were having a discussion on February 23rd, you would often hear a day without space, what are your comm networks going to look like, whatever down that line of thinking. And February 25th, 26th, 27th, comms were challenged. And then Elon Musk said, I got an idea. And in comes a whole bunch of receivers for Starlink. And so you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, this push of the commercial, to one of your earlier questions, commercial technology, is it ready for military use? Would it pass all the standards of dropping it in all these weather conditions? Maybe not. Is it incredibly effective in a modern battlefield? Absolutely. And I think we're seeing a way we can enable a partner country, in this case, with all the great efforts that not only the U.S., but our NATO allies and other allies. So I think that's in Ukraine context. Bringing it out to the great power competition in the Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific more broadly, I think you're seeing great efforts with not only our country with Japan, to think of AUKUS, think of the efforts with the Japanese essentially adapting their self-defense force in partnership with various elements of the U.S. Joint Force on a daily basis, working on various elements of domain awareness together, leveraging these technologies. Seeing the same thing in the Philippines with the recent announcement there with their coastal defense regiment. So I'm very optimistic. Again, we got a lot of work to do. Everybody, those in the audience here, those online, this isn't a foregone conclusion. We got work to do. I'm optimistic.
Another question, how is STEM education being implemented into military training and into the services to help us keep up with these kinds of technological developments?
Well, I'll take that one again, because if there's any students out there, I'm looking at you again, slowly and painfully. Let me give you an example. I want to teach just basic data science, how to make a graph, how to interpret it, how to do some basic statistical tests. But we can't run the commercial and academic standard software called R, which is free. So I'm not trying to sell some program. It's free, right? We cannot load those on DoD networks. And any attempt to do so would likely be a multi-year saga of this broken process he's talking about. So I have to literally teach grown men and women to use Microsoft Excel to do statistics. Now the good news is you can do a lot in Excel. The bad news is that's all they're going to find in secure networks as well,
Right.
which is just a tragic. So when I deployed last, it was the last ground intelligence battalion in Afghanistan, and we had to send Specialist Burner to take the Wi-Fi from the gym to write a Python script to scrape key data that we couldn't get on our exquisite networks, and we couldn't do the statistics or the coding we needed. Just think about that for a second. A major operation in the middle of a collapse of a partner country, and our own bureaucracy and unwillingness to use technology that is freely available limits our ability to visualize and describe operations, and that allows commanders to direct them. So I think that it's not just STEM education, they have to know how to use it. We need to start really holding bureaucrats accountable. One of the sad truths in most bureaucracies is that a lot of bureaucrats are unaccountable. Anyone can say no for no good reason, and we never walk back through and count the number of times they say no, which is a data problem, relative to whether they were allowed to, or if it increased the amount of labor costs or time to solve routine problems. So if you think of the sheer amount of hours we spend in the Defense Department every day by bad processes and bad bureaucracy, it's a harder question than just STEM education. I do think the STEM education should become a critical part of military training. And it's not hard. I think we think it's harder than it is. It's actually not hard. And then two, it's not just that you teach them how to build those models, those ways of visualizing and describing their world. You have to also allow them access to even just the basic systems to take it to the next level. And we don't have that right now.
Well, with that, we are at time. I want to thank you both so much for joining us today. Lieutenant Colonel Cuomo, Scott, and Ben, thank you for writing this book. Thank you for paying it forward in doing so and giving us a set of intellectual tools for thinking about how AI can be or not adapted within the military services, within the Department of Defense, which is just one of the central questions that we're grappling with today. And also for giving us the chia pet of deterrence, which is, you're never living that one down.
That's all right. That's all right. Thank you for Smart Women, Smart Power, and really letting diverse voices shine, Kathleen.
Well, thank you very much. For our online audience, there's plenty of interesting content on all the issues that are facing our nation today on the CSIS website. So stick around, take a look at what's out there, and have a wonderful afternoon.